There's a lot of talk about well-being, which came through all around the world in the research. And I think what came through is this very strong sense of a need for trust, for empathy from leaders, for approaching their workforce in a kind of way that was very focused on engagement, asking questions as opposed to telling people what to do.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I'm your host, Sadhna Smiles, and I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. Today, we are diving into the world of executive leadership and talent search with IMD Executive Search, a prestigious global network of executive search and leadership advisory firms. For over 50 years, IMD has been at the forefront of identifying and placing top-tier CEOs, C-suite executives, and board members around the world. What sets IMD apart is its unique ability to leverage the insights and expertise of its consultants across 25 countries and providing deep local knowledge alongside a global perspective. As we navigate the complexities of today's leadership landscape, one theme has become abundantly clear. There is a pressing need for a new evolution of leadership, one that is deeply purposeful and rooted in culture and people and driven by openness and integrity. The demands on leaders are now more personal and holistic than ever before. Generational shifts, the global pandemic, the geopolitical uncertainties have all reshaped workplace dynamics. In this evolving context, employees are increasingly seeking leaders who not only espouse strong values and a clear sense of purpose, but also demonstrate those values through real actions, such as genuine commitments to environment, sustainability, and governance. Gone are the days of command and control. Today's workforce is more engaged, vocal, and critical, with higher expectations for inclusion, democracy, and flexibility. Leaders are now being asked to embody a more human, approachable, and even vulnerable side. They must not only promote a balanced, well-rounded work environment, but also adapt to these needs of a younger, more mobile workforce, one that values well-being and work-life harmony over traditional notions of career sacrifice. Today, we talk to Ben Tucker on the recent IMD research, where they interviewed a panel of CEOs and board members of national and global companies in 18 different countries. We chat to Ben about how leadership is evolving in this current context of change, the implications for this for business strategy and trends in executive talent, and new challenges and tendencies in talent acquisition. This is a fascinating conversation to listen to. Please enjoy my conversation with Ben Tucker. Hello, Ben Tucker. Lovely to meet you. You are in the UK. I am in Australia, and we have made the time zones work. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership.
Thanks very much. Great to meet you.
So we're here to talk about the IMD research that you have been involved in, and really fascinating some of the results that you've got, which we will be having a conversation about. Maybe perhaps give us some idea or sense of what IMD research is about.
Sure. So maybe I'll start off by giving some background to the IMD group and how we work and what brings us together. So IMD is a coalition of currently nearly 40 companies from around the world, all of whom undertake executive search and leadership advisory services. We're all entrepreneurial firms, generally speaking, all partner-led or led by founders, and we're committed to senior level delivery and personal service. And I think this is distinctive in an industry where larger firms are becoming increasingly faceless and sort of volume oriented in approach. And around the world, when we meet up, we reflect on the fact that we find we work best with clients and candidates who are thinking innovatively and understanding that we need new approaches to meet the challenges of the future world. And the idea for this research came from a conference we had in Barcelona when we were all together, and we were reflecting on the way that cultures and expectations in the workplace, what that means for leadership, has been changing over the past decades. And I suppose some of what we were talking about was in particular response to the pandemic, and the new working practices that brought about, particularly in office-based roles. But it also incorporated the societal change going on around us, where for as many of the memberships, who were coming from countries where there was a distinctively aging workforce, there are also people coming from countries where there's a sort of explosion of young people and people under the age of 25. We also kind of, I think, reflected upon the generational nuance of change, and particularly these themes which are connected with Gen Z, which kind of inhabit the way that workforces are developing. And as well as this technology, and of course, we'll say a bit about AI. In particular, in Europe, there was concern about the impact of war and general geopolitical tension, and the driver for sustainability, and the way all of these factors come together to affect the kind of current context of leadership. The way we did the research, I think, was quite special, because typically for projects of this type, if you're looking at an international network or an international firm doing a piece of research, it will be almost entirely outsourced to a third party. But I think the strength of our research was that we all interviewed in our local markets. We focused primarily on chief executives, CEOs, and chairs of boards, and we all undertook the data collection ourselves. So Ana Luisa was working in Brazil, Sylvia in the USA, Pascal in France, Malta in Switzerland, Ava in Sweden. And most of the firms across the 40 or so in the network participated. So we ended up with a very rich data set.
So Ben, I love the fact that it was a global research done, because quite often we only look at what's happening locally, and it's really fascinating that, when you take a global research like that some of the things that you've landed on are issues that leaders are facing locally and nationally as well. And I'm going to start, because I want to talk about, post-pandemic and the challenges that leaders have faced post-2020. What were some of the key things that your research showed that were the key challenges for leaders post-pandemic?
Actually, it was interesting because the pandemic was very much a context for what we heard in the research. But I think most of the people we spoke to recognized that, in a sense, it accentuated themes that they'd been seeing for quite a long time. And one of the people I interviewed joked that feels like about 10 years ago, we switched tracks and went off into an alternative universe, and that these sort of changes had been beginning. And then I think COVID came along and added a whole kind of pace and rapidity to that change. I think some of what this means for leaders, I think maybe there are 3 or 4 themes I'd bring out. And one is a really kind of heightened emphasis on the need for authenticity and visibility in leadership. I think we found ourselves in a period of time where there's a lot of anxiety in relation to the context around us, whether it's war or concerns around the environment, increasing proportion of senile men with their fingers on the button in significant leadership roles in politics. And I think this has highlighted a real desire for meaning in work. There's a lot of talk about well-being, which came through all around the world in the research. I think what came through is this very strong sense of a need for trust, for empathy from leaders, approaching their workforce in a kind of way that was very focused on engagement, asking questions as opposed to telling people what to do. So I think that a clear theme around authenticity and visibility. Then I think something around recognizing that narratives of purpose need to be genuine in a way that maybe they didn't have to be before. I think if you look back 10 or 15 years to the birth of corporate social responsibility, and then how that's sort of grown into ESG, and then in many countries the emphasis on equality, diversity, and inclusion that also has grown up. I think what came through from the research was that perhaps historically there had been a sense that these were things that businesses and employers were realizing they needed to take on board, and they would set up units maybe on the edge of their organizations to deal with them. But now there's a much clearer sense that, particularly, with the arrival of Gen Z in the workforce and this sort of socially progressive, digitally native group of people, that these initiatives need to be somehow mainstreamed into the businesses. It's not enough to simply kind of add them on the side as a sort of limpet on the side of the organization. And I think it's now a workforce, of any generation, where the scales have sort of fallen off their eyes. There's an expectation that broader purpose and mission is taken seriously. So I think for senior leaders, there's a very strong message about how to centralize this. And I think this is also, in terms of sustainability, there's, what came through in the research was an increasing focus on that, and I guess this is in a context where governments around the world have not responded very actively to the environmental challenges around us. And so, in particular, the private sector, I think, is being invited to take more of a leadership role in this. And in particular, our Swedish colleagues, in connection with this research, are doing some quite groundbreaking work on what this means for organizations and leadership in the future.
I want to pick on the Gen Z conversation, because I think they're actually forcing leaders to think differently, particularly when you come to the environmental. They are very connected to what's happening in the environment. They require or like to see businesses with a purpose that's attached to doing good in society. And I think, and then you add the technology piece on top of that. So how are you seeing leaders actually navigate multi-generational workplaces where perhaps, a boomer or the next generation doesn't have the same requirements that a Gen Z does, but really I'm probably going to focus on the Gen Z because they are the next generation in my workplace that I've got to really engage with?
I think this was something that a lot of the people we interviewed reflected on as being a challenge. And I think never before have we seen more of a diverse need from people at different stages of their career journey, particularly within large organizations. And I think you could see this very clearly with people who are perhaps more middle-aged, with families for whom actually the opportunity that COVID gave to put in place a work structure, which involved working from home quite a lot more, was actually kind of very attractive. And these are also people who are at the stage in their career where you might say that they've been fully socialized into the work environment. They understand what's required. They understand sort of how to adapt their behaviors to be effective in an organizational culture. Whereas with younger people, I think it's much more challenging. And a number of people described this sense of, I think, particularly as we were coming further out of COVID, an awareness of the isolation that younger people were feeling when they were working from home, particularly during COVID, but within organizations that, made these brave statements after COVID that they weren't going to have an office again. And I think it's then raised quite a lot of questions around the meaning of work, and sort of, a number of the people we talked to reflected on the fact that in professional service life or in office-based roles, we actually spend quite a lot of the time doing tasks which are kind of routine or repetitive. And once we've mastered them, we can do them repeatedly. And actually, a very important part of work then becomes the social experience and the bringing together of people. This wasn't a question that I think many of the people we interviewed thought that they had the final answer to, but it was something they were very reflective on. I also think with Gen Z, there is a challenge as well, which is quite a few of the people we interviewed. On one hand, it was clear that they really value the engagement that this generation is bringing to the workforce, the demand for putting in place meaning, purpose, and structure, and a focus on well-being. But on the other, they were also reflecting on the fact that, they're working in a context where probably the majority of global economies are facing productivity problems, national debt is at crazy levels. Businesses were also having to focus on some quite primary survival motivations. And I think many of them were kind of struggling with how do you square this off? How do you make the difficult resource allocation choices between investing in sustainability, ESG, workforce well-being, but also actually kind of ensuring that you have a healthy financial picture in your business. I think with technology as well, this also, it becomes even more interesting, I think, and I think reflecting on the question of sort of meaningful work, one of the themes that came up was an awareness of the importance for leaders really focusing on strategic horizon scanning. And I think this was, in this context that we've described where change is around us, I suppose the possibility of surprising disruption is there in a lot of sectors in the way that it wasn't before. And, this potential of technology, in particular AI, to perform or support not just simple, but even complex tasks in the workplace, which has obvious implications for what future workforces might look like, organizational design, even implications for organizational cultures and how people work together and what sort of things they're doing together, as well as the nature of work. And I think also kind of, in a way, something bemusing about how even to plan organization, because the speed of change is so quick and it's not obvious kind of what the next change might be. And I think this was something that people felt will be an increasing theme over the next 4 to 5 years. A large proportion also recognize that if we go into AI and technology seeing it simply as a set of challenges, we'll miss the opportunities that it will also bring to do things very differently. One person used this analogy. It's like a very souped up motorcycle, and it's the role of leaders and organizations to be careful riders of the souped up motorcycle.
Because there's a lot of conversation, isn't it, that AI is going to replace a certain percentage of the workforce. How are leaders reacting to that? I mean, is that a reality? It will take leaders in organizations to actually make that happen if the AI is capable of it. Is that something leaders are seriously considering because it impacts the bottom line in a particular way, or, it creates a different workforce in different sectors? How is that looking at playing out?
So I think there are 4 or 5 themes that came through in the research, which are not, in a sense, some of them have a paradoxical relationship with each other. I think on one hand, one of the themes was definitely a real sense of excitement about the possibilities that this would bring, and with a recognition that it might well be kind of new startup businesses that are most able to kind of embrace this. I think there was a sense that much larger organizations were a little bit bemused about how you would begin to respond to both the opportunities that AI would bring in terms of reshaping the sort of jobs that there were and the sort of work that people did, but also how you would deal with a workforce that is kind of quite deeply programmed to do what it does. And of course, some quite monumental costs involved in making those sorts of changes. And I think also there was also recognition that perhaps the third point is there's this sort of mantra that if you don't get on board, you'll miss it and, you'll be left behind. But of course, what we see with change of that nature is you do get a lot of people who have the advantage of being early movers, but stuff trickles through eventually anyway. So I think there's also a sense that lots of leaders are waiting to see what happens, and this is also in a context where if you think back across the last 25 years, there have been so many technological fads which we've been told would change everything completely and actually haven't had as immediate effects as we thought they might. So I think there is a mixture of approaches to it.
It's a really dynamic environment for leaders to be operating in. How is this impacting the culture of the businesses, particularly when, we've had a lot of changes, technology is moving really fast, we've got a, multi-generational workplace, we've got hybrid workplace, we've got all of these changes around putting a focus onto the environment, etc. It does play out in the culture of an organization when things become that dynamic. What are you seeing around that?
I think the key themes are around this need for engagement with the workforce and cultivating a sense that we're kind of in a collaborative endeavor. And I think in a way, sort of, to my mind, the clearest indication of it is some of the things we heard around governance from talking to some of the chairs and the board members that we interview, where I think it's clear that in the European and Latin American context, for example, there's been a longer history of engaging with what's going on in the organization at board level. But I think even in kind of more Anglo-Saxon environments, there's now an awareness that the board needs to be taking account of what's happening within the culture of the organization, what the employees are saying, what the employee voice is. And it's becoming more common, even in the Anglo-Saxon environment, to have representation or structured ways of listening to what's going on in the organization. And I think also an awareness that what happens at governance level also needs to take account of some of these broader social responsibility and ESG concerns as well. It can't simply be just about maximizing profits.
Yeah. Well, it's no longer about that at all. It makes me wonder what sort of leaders are required in the future and even today. And I know that you've said that future leaders will need to be superhuman or even unicorns.
Yeah.
What are some of the traits and capabilities that makes a future leader a unicorn or superhuman?
So I think one of the themes that came through was the ability, if you like, to have eyes in all directions. And the people we interviewed talked about this sense, which I think has always been there, of if you're the leader in an organization, of having to build the plane but fly it at the same time. Not only that, there was this sense that, we would be encountering more sudden storms and more turbulence than we ever have before. And I think one of the things that came through, I guess, connected with that was just this sense that resilience is going to be absolutely critical. It's very unusual, apart from in some sectors, that you have consistent patterns of kind of success and thriving. And there's often a lot more ups and downs, I think, that people were describing, in some senses accentuated by COVID. They talked kind of quite openly about needing to look after themselves in that context as leaders, but also approach what they were doing with a sort of kind of humility and actually recognition of the fact that they weren't unicorns and that quite a lot was happening which was out of their control. Quite a lot of external factors are now influencing things in a way that they didn't before. And in that context, it's very important to recognize that it isn't possible to be superhuman. I think they also reflected a lot about the toughness required of balancing things. And I think completely gone are the days of the heroic leader who can sort of stand at the front and lead with just charisma. But there was a sense that they needed to be cultivating this very strong collaborative sense. And given that tough decisions would have to be made about, how do we balance this kind of increasing requirement for workforces to be focused on well-being and culturally safe places for people to be, with actually just basic business imperatives of ensuring the business is successful and surviving.
How are these leaders creating support networks or systems around them? Because it is a change, as you said. Gone are the days where you can stand out the front and say, "I'm the hero." Nothing will ever impact me. And so, how are they creating this? And it requires authenticity and vulnerability to large extents to have resilience, but also be open. Share with your people where you are, how you're feeling. There's a whole range of different emotions that leaders are now expected to have. So, what support systems are they putting around themselves?
There's not a lot in there that's kind of brand new, I think, but there's definitely a lot of the CEOs in particular talked about the fact that they're leaning on coaching, they're working with mentors, even sort of groups where they're bringing together people in sort of action learning set type activities. And many of them said these are the sorts of things we probably wouldn't have done 5 or 6 years ago, but increasingly that opportunity to find other ways of hearing what other people are going through and kind of sharing concerns and challenges has been really important. That's probably the key thing, I think.
Effective communication in this hybrid world of work, technology changes, globalization. How are leaders finding effective, or how are they communicating in an effective way?
I mean, clearly some of this is dependent upon the size of the context they were in, but many of the people that we spoke to were in larger organizational environments, and a lot of them were talking quite openly about the opportunities that new technology has brought about, social media and ways of communicating with the whole organization. I think the challenge that many of them were facing with this was, we talked earlier about this. It's a workforce which is more skeptical, I think, than it's ever been before about communications from the center, which are seen as being pat or trite. And a lot of them were talking about seeing a need to professionalize the way they communicated in a way that they hadn't before, making much more use of professional advice, taking a lot of feedback on how they were coming across. And I think it's entirely about maximizing this sense of authenticity and honesty in the way that they communicate. Also, creating a culture of openness is almost as important as this regularity of communication with the workforce, I think.
How are boards playing a role in this? And is that role, the role that boards play in businesses, is that changing as, leadership requirements change and businesses change?
We heard a lot about a sort of evolution going on at governance level. A lot of people talked about the fact that the days of boards being disconnected from the organization and considering strategy and numbers as separate from culture and purpose have gone. Also gone are the days of the executives and the non-executives sitting metaphorically on the opposite side of the table from one another. In particular, the chairs that we talked to in this process described a process of working collaboratively with the executive to ensure that governance is more holistic. I think, put very simply, a recognition that boards exist to support the executive in developing and delivering strategy, and that all of the, if you like, more traditional compliance activities, the oversight activities, should be seen as part of that, not as the sort of primary objective for the board existing. So I think, we heard people talk about the importance of ensuring a collaborative culture, and the board members broadening and deepening their perspective of what's going on in the organization and understanding the culture and the people that make up the business, developing the board to maximize the quality of communications. The historic sense is that boards have been kind of mystified somehow. People look up to them and it happens in a closed room, and they assume that boards have this kind of level of, if you like, kind of autocratic control and the ability to kind of change things completely. We heard a lot about this, the importance of boards kind of opening up what they do and becoming a little bit more transparent to the organization. And I think very practically as well for boards embracing new technology and new ways of working. I think there are very few boards now that are simply working in a way of, meeting all in person 4 times a year. And I think a lot seem to be shifting towards more touch points, which are shorter and more discursive than in the past.
Do you think that is enabling businesses to make decisions a lot faster?
It should be. We didn't hear in the research anybody say this has made things much more effective.
Slower, yeah,
or slower, but we didn't hear either really. But it may be more about the fact that there is just an expectation of rapid responses to things, even if it's not clear that actually makes things more efficient. I think in a sense, I think it's ultimately it's the drive, it's the thing that email has brought about really, which is that everybody expects to have a response to any question within a very short time frame. I think this is rolled out across all organizations.
It would also be a really fine balance, wouldn't it, be been around a board being involved but not becoming too operational, because then that doesn't work either.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is the one of the kind of core questions of governance, I think, isn't it? Which is, where do the dividing lines sit between executive activity and non-executive activity, and how does each side build a culture of trust in that context where there is as large a shared space of working together as there can possibly be? Each side is holding each other accountable for respecting those boundaries, I think.
What are some of the practical things that you discovered that boards were doing to make the executives and CEOs feel more supported and less judged?
I think there's 3 or 4 things. I think one thing is kind of well understood, I think, and often spoken of, which is the criticality of the relationship between the chair and the chief executive. We explored with the chairs we spoke to. In a sense, they have this kind of critical soft role of sitting between the executive and the rest of the non-executives. They're there as much for the chief executive as they are for other board directors, I think. Recognizing that there's a complexity there, it's something that needs to be held in solution, I think is critical for that relationship. Because when you have chairs who sit solely on the non-executive side, you're I think setting up a culture of opposition potentially. Then I think a lot we're talking about this sense that it's really important for directors and non-executives to build relationships and an understanding of what's actually going on in the business, who the people are, where the strength is at top level, so that they can be approaching discussions with a kind of understanding of the actual context that the chief executive is working in. There's something about humility, I think, that came across a lot in the research, and the importance of boards understanding that they are never going to be as close to the business as the executive are.
Well, they can't be. They're not in it every day.
Yeah. And that the executive, therefore, this idea that the board set strategy and the executive deliver it is in some ways nonsense.
Yeah.
Because the executive have to own and develop strategy that they can then deliver. And the board has a role in co-creation, but it isn't a controlling role if things are going to work well.
I want to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity and how that piece of research played out, because it's very broad. But I do want to, narrow it a bit. We're talking about diversity for people from diverse backgrounds, diversity of more women on boards, more female CEOs. Then you can bring it down to generations in the workplace, etc. But overall, what was the findings around diversity, inclusion, and equity?
I think actually this was the area where there was most diversity across all of the countries. What we found, which we expected, I think, was that each country has its own quite advanced set of discussions around equality and diversity, largely connected with its own history, what that has meant in terms of the makeup of the people living in the country and the international nature or not of the workforce. Indeed, in some countries, it's much less of an interest or concern than it is in some others. I think what we heard was that in a large proportion of the countries, I mean, the UK, Australia, United States, Brazil came through very clearly, and most of the countries, I would say, in Europe, a very strong sense that there were clearly structural inequalities still in the workplace, and that this was something that, from a primary business point of view, if businesses were going to succeed, this is something that will continue to need to be tackled. And in some countries, there's a lot has been done to ensure, for example, that you have initiatives like the 30% Club, which I think have been very successful in being at the center of this drive towards increasing, for example, the number of women on boards. I think one theme that came through, and I see this particularly in the British environment, which is a concern that a lot of effort is put into saying the right things, and that sometimes this is almost a proxy for real action. So people are willing to spend money on research which tells us how bad the picture is, and having champagne breakfast at the House of Lords and things like that. But actually that the fundamental change of heart, if you like, which would lead to particularly business boards not just being old boys clubs, there's still something quite significant to do, even though there has been a lot of progress over the past year.
Was there a sense that there were legitimate, changes in play, or was this a little bit more, lip service to something that they, perhaps need to pay some lip service to, as opposed to, no, we have a plan in place to move our organisation forward, and this is what it looks like?
Actually, I think both are true. I think that what came through was a really strong recognition that a lot of change is happening. The statistics are changing. And that also, for example, at CEO level, This is resulting in, as more diverse people take on leadership roles, this is actually resulting in a wider and more holistic view of leadership and therefore kind of what kind of organizations we might end up with. There is also a kind of undercurrent that pops up or that we see where you sometimes sense that in some organizations, if we can get away with saying the right things, we will. I think the other thing that a tiny concern for those of us that are really committed to EDI is in certain countries, you're beginning to see a little bit of a backlash. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I think this is the case in the United States at the moment. I think it will be interesting to see how that plays out over the next decade or so.
Ben, thank you so much for your time and for sharing the insights. It's very early in the UK, so it's probably breakfast time for you now, but I really appreciate you waking up early and taking the time to have a chat to me. It's really interesting research. Where is it available generally, and where could people find it?
So you can find it on the IMD website.
Wonderful. Ben, thank you so much for your time. It was lovely to connect with you.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.